Thank you, Keith. Good morning, everybody. Thanks to James Way and Chickmaster Incubator Company for the invitation to share with you this talk about the impact of incubation in performance, health, and welfare. This is one of our main topics in research and in extension and during my consultant activities. We work with a lot of experts in incubation, and we have had the chance to interact with some of the best scientists in incubation throughout the years. And we don't have time to acknowledge all of them, but actually this presentation includes some of their knowledge and what we have accumulated throughout the years. So the objectives of this presentation is to emphasize the importance of incubation in bird development. Frequently, we consider the hatcheries like a cost center, but in reality, they are the heart of the production cycle. If we are not in in an integration, we need to think that the hatchery is providing the animals with the quality that we really need in order to obtain the best results that we want, either for meat or even for eggs, because there are impacts that last for the rest of the whole life, or including during the reproduction. So we are going to see some of those that we have evaluated well, especially in broilers, but I can tell you that we had also worked with turkeys and with ducks, and we can tell you that any bird is affected and it has important impacts in all aspects of life post-hatch. So really, the embryo development, we know that it starts inside of the hen. So then when we receive the eggs in the hatchery, we already have them in a level of development that has passed for different stresses and different changes, and that make it a little bit bearable. And remember that when you see just a few cells that are thousands of cells already in an egg when you get it in the hatchery. So the time that they spend in the house and also during the transportation are very important. And even the environment where the hen is located during the laying process, or even during the whole development of the egg, is also a factor to consider when we want to know the quality of those eggs. And then what we are going to do during this review is to check on those phases that are important, like the farm and transportation. That is part of the incubation. Many companies include the breeders in the whole program of reproduction. So we also have to think about the storage time, that if it is too short or too long. And some managements, like they are getting common, like the spiders, is another technique that we can do to improve the quality of those eggs. The pre-warming process that you do prior to incubation is also another important aspect, that is even before you put it in the setters, and making sure that you don't have microenvironments in those setters, that you can have uniform conditions and that you have the right conditions is very important to obtain better quality hatchlings. And definitely the hatchers, I consider the hatchers are quite the most important, because big part of the maturation of the whole development, the final step of the whole the embryo development happens in the hatchers. Even if you have them only for a day and a half, or you complete the 2 days and a half or more, then really is where they can have more stress. They can be more susceptible to that stress, and that could affect a little bit their life. Also, the processing of chicks. The time that those chicks spend in the hatchery right after they go out of the machines could make important changes on their life. And cold stress, heat stress, lack of oxygen, all of those can happen, injuries. Those things can damage the quality of your chicks. And the chick transportation, the product only will have that quality that we need when we are able to deliver it with good quality, and that includes that the truck that is delivering this, or the vehicle, whatever it is that you use to get the chickens to the farms, is it has the best condition possible. And There are so many factors to check in the development of the embryos that will affect their life later on. We don't have time to go into much detail in all of them, but we will cover some of those, and you will see that they impact absolutely all aspects of their life. The only thing is that depending on when that it changes in temperature, in turning, in light, in a oxygen concentration, in humidity, when they happen and for how long they will last and how extreme are those conditions, then they will have the embryo can have a different response. And all is related with something that the biologists know for many years, that is the plasticity of this embryo. The embryo changes according to the conditions where they have to try to survive. And no matter what you do, they will try to get or continue going on that development. So one important aspect that we have to check on development is from the time that they are collected, so that they will be in a stage of development that I think that has been reviewed in previous webinars here. There are several classification methods of the morphology of the embryos and all that. But from the time of oviposition that we saw when the hen lays the egg until the time that we do the storage, we should have them in these levels of development that are based on this classification of Eyal, Giladi, and Koshab, that some people from Israel that developed this methodology to classify where they should be. And if we can keep them and collect them during this time, and we can reduce the temperature in the farm to have them in this level of the storage, then we can have ideal conditions to allow them to renew themselves. But if we allow them to continue further, then there is going to be a point of no return. Once that they start developing this primitive, strict, then the cells start to develop in a way that the animal needs to continue with the differentiation of the different organs. Otherwise, it will not survive, or there are going to be important changes. But during that time, between the time that they are collected at the farm and what happens going to the hatchery, then we can have transportation issues, we can have vibration. And something that is important to consider in management is the differences that can happen in a truck in the different cases of the truck. Here we have the map for the temperature, the relative humidity here in blue, and in green here, the different energy or dry temperature that you can have. And all these factors can be variable in a truck if you don't have good fans moving the air. And the other factor that can affect that truck will be the vibration. So if we have too much vibration, we will affect mainly the membranes where the embryo is developing, and will affect its respiration and its development. So sometimes that fact of moving the eggs and letting them set a few hours, hopefully a whole day after transportation, is important to renew these cells and make sure that the membranes will be still valid before we start the development. Otherwise, the embryo can suffer and be difficult for the initial differentiation of those cells. And I have been talking about differentiation because every single line that when you observe an egg and you see that dona of the blastoderm that is developing, and you see those cells that are moving, each circle of line is actually going to help with the development of one type of different organ. That could be either the digestive, that could be the body, the muscles, the skin, the bones, and the brain as well. That is the reason that sometimes high temperature early in life affects the brain. Well, that is one of the things that starts to develop in first. Later, we also have some that will affect the development of the amniotic sac, and also how that animal will be able to use the yolk sac. And so anything that happens with those few cells in the first hour, the first day, can affect them in those organs, and the impact will be different. So during the storage time, there are some of these cells can die. It's normal that they die, but there is a mechanism where you have apoptosis and renovation of those cells. If you can renovate those cells, and that is what the spiders does, is in the same way that the hen will do it to give them a little heat and a little turning every time. So in the nest, that is what the hens normally do when they have to storage their eggs. So the spiders is a very similar system that we do mechanically, and many of you are very familiar with doing this. And there are plenty of proofs. I just brought one of those in 2018 where they compare this between doing an storage without doing anything here in this color in this situation, and you observe the final result. If you don't see it at the beginning, if you don't see the hatchability that we know that is improved when you do this type of turning and heating during the storage to try to keep the viability of those cells, then you are going to see probably some better hatchability, a few points that you will gain instead of not doing anything. But one thing that is important to know is that the impact probably you will see it at the end. The performance at the end, the quality of the chicks, we have seen improvements in full pad dermatitis, we have seen improvements in quality of the skin. Many other factors that are related just with the quality of the animal can be improved by doing something right during the storage time. And later, we go to the preheating right prior to incubation. That is a process where you have to move those eggs uniformly. That is very important. If you do this without moving air, without making sure that the whole set of eggs has a uniformity and moving from the temperature of incubation, whatever you have, 18 degrees, 19 degrees, or you are at 65, or you are in 70 degrees, and you move them to Fahrenheit, you move them from 75 to going to the 37.8 of the incubation that happens normally in two phases, where you get them first from the storage to a room, or where you do this pre-warming or a machine, and later you move them from that to the point of incubation. So that is those steps, if they are not going uniformly, what you are going to do is to change that. The flock will have issues with uniformity, a lot of variability in the development. So the pre-warming will reduce that early mortality. That is another factor when you don't pre-warm those eggs very well, or if you have problems with embryo development that affects them for life. You can reduce the late embryo mortality sometimes if you do good pre-warming, because many times that will cause that you have a shorter hatch window, and that will help with the quality. Harvest could be synchronized better, and then you will have a chick quality because they won't dehydrate that much. You can reduce the temperature variability in between sex when you have different when you do sets in a multi-stage machine. And now, when you go to the setter, you are going to have different factors that the machine will control: the temperature, the ventilation, the humidity, the turning. Sometimes people are applying lights even. But all these factors, really, we tend to study, and we want to investigate them and keep records separately. But something that I learned a long time ago with some of the best scientists and on this is that in the reality, they never are separately. They are always interacting. And it's exactly like you learn in theory, in mathematical theory. The factors start to interact, and the conjunction of factors could be worse. So many times a problem with turning will create you those microenvironments where you are going to have higher CO2, higher humidity, higher ventilation, problems with temperature. So the chick will suffer of heat stress, but it's a conjunction of factors that are causing that. And it could be due to just a problem with turning, a problem with diverter, or a system that will direct the air, the fans, any factor, water that is sometimes in some of the machines are dripping and causing cool areas and other hot areas, resistance that are not working, and then another part of the heating system in another part of the machine has to work harder to keep the average temperature of the section of the machine or the whole machine. and then you have hot areas and a cooler area. And sometimes it happens when you don't have those fans moving a lot of air, the central part of the trays can be affected, and then you are going to have eggs that in the same machine, some are uh, on the right temperature, and the others in the middle could be a little hotter. That will create variation during the whole system. In single stage incubation, you can control better the development of the embryos. You know that you are especially moving the temperature and the humidity. You can also control the CO2 concentration because you are able to close the machines, and then your 5 days at least are going to have a better CO2 concentration coming directly from the embryos that are producing the CO2, and by physiology, then that will help them with the pH, with the development of the membranes, with better circulation, with better oxygenation later on. So you get blood vessels that will help with that embryo to develop better on. But comparing this single stage with a multi-stage, something that is clear is that the first phase, we normally are always a little cooler than we should be. There are some people that tend to use machines really cool, like 99.3, to avoid issues with the embryos that are finishing the development here. And that is what happens. Then there are just a few days where the multi-stage and single stage are given the optimum conditions. So the multi-stage, it's given the optimum conditions like it will do it a single stage machine. And at the end of the incubation in the multi-stage machines, normally all those machines will be hotter, and then consequently, then the embryos cannot maintain those 100 degrees of eggshell temperature that we want. Normally, the studies have shown that it's 100 degrees of eggshell temperature in 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and with maybe with turkeys and dogs, some studies have shown that a little less will be okay. But anything above that, I hear a lot, 101. 101 happens, but it doesn't mean that it's the best condition. So then, yes, it's allowed, it's okay. But if you go a little further than that, there is no doubt that you are making that these embryos develop faster than they should. And sometimes the quality of the chicks fails. Not probably at hatch. You will see it later on. And that is what we are going to see, that the embryo is affected in all their systems, especially the thyroid hormones and many other hormones are affected, but all the muscles, bones, tendons, cardiovascular system, gastrointestinal system, immunity tissues. We are just now working in a couple of books for the effects of incubation in birds in general, in all poultry. And we have a hard time to find which topics to cover, because all these we have very nice proof, very nice science developed in the last 40, 50 years, but especially in the last years when people have this molecular biology and are able to test what happens really in cells, that later you can track that in quality of meat. And we will go there in a second, and showing that those effects have been already proven, and that we work in incubation many times. These seminars are attended by people that are incubation. They should be also attended by the managers of the company to understand that in these hatcheries the impact is so big that we need to put more attention, even more investments on what you do in quality of incubation. So we will see that the incubation affects growth, intake, feed conversion. Even I have not been able to measure and have not seen the system to measure water intake, but I will show you that even water intake and how the animal use water is also affected. So there are some common issues that we see in chick quality that are not infectious, and some that are infectious that could be related with incubation, like cardiovascular development and physiology. Many proofs have shown that stress, especially hypoxia and high temperatures during the hatching time, especially the last 48 hours during embryo development, can affect and cause ascites, can cause a higher incidence of sudden death syndrome. And the myopathies, we have a very good proof. We published a chapter last year showing all the evidence that myopathies could be influenced by what happens in the hatcher during the last phases of embryo development. 3 more papers show up this year in the past 2-3 months showing that this happens in commercial conditions where people have been able to track myopathies in the field compared to what happens in machines, in commercial machines. And also leg problems and locomotion. We had during 15 years, we published a lot of information on this, and there are groups that have done excellent work in showing, demonstrating this. So there is little doubt that they really affect bones in this way. Pododermatitis, we have a good body of information that I'll show in a second, and feathering is affected, skin and feathering, because the collagen, all these have in general in common that the collagen is affected because the embryos are very susceptible to change many enzymes when they have stress, when they have especially heat stress. Then we'll see some effects also in the gastrointestinal development. So all this part of intestinal health for both ways, for the development of the organs, the development of the enzymes, maturation of these systems, enzymatic systems, and also due to the changes in the development of the gut-associated lymphoid tissue that is important for the immunity of the gut system. So the immunology is also affected, and we'll see it in a second. Many of you probably have seen this information, which shows that single-stage incubation compared to multi-stage incubation gives us a different chick throughout the whole life of the breeders. That is what we have here. The whole breeder production, and at least until 50 weeks, shows how the body weights of those chicks are a little higher. And it's not just moisture that really proves that the yolk-free body weight also has a better development. The embryo is able to use those nutrients from the yolk sac at the end better, and consequently the embryo finishes with a better development. So what I'm going to show in big part of this presentation is related with some experiments, many different experiments that we have done. Sometimes there is no chance to do to evaluate all the organs in one single experiment, just because there is physically you cannot not do it. And there are many people attending here that have helped with those experiments, including Carolina, that works for Chickmaster. She has worked with us in that sense as well. And we had seen that in the past, we tested always these treatments where we have these different eggshell temperatures. We try to simulate what is a single stage, where we have eggshell temperature close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. That is this 37.8, 30.1. That is a little higher than the 100 exactly, but never going up to 101. And sometimes in some machines, when they don't do especially the pre-warming, so the eggs takes hours and sometimes even days if they are very cool, if the machine is not really warming those areas, where you can have some trays that will go to lower temperatures than desired. So the eggshell temperature never reaches really the 100 degrees after only 48, 72 hours later. Later, at the end, especially in the hatches, we have this situation where they get overheated just because the machine doesn't reduce the temperatures, what it happens normally in a single stage, and especially when people in the hatches don't reduce the temperatures. And that is something that any machine in the world could do. Any machine could improve their cooling capacities, even whatever older they are. We have helped, and we have seen many people that are very that have a lot of innovation to know how to improve those cooling capacities, and in that way they can have a better and quality of those chicks. And something that is for me more important is that the data, you are able to track the data, you have traceability of your flocks. I bet you that you will be able to determine this in your companies, where you are going to see better performance. Is big? I don't know. It depends. For me, 30 grams, 35, 41 grams is what we normally get in average. So at the end of the flock at 42 days, that is the range of improvement in body weight that you will get, and it's significant. We have tested under commercial conditions many times with different machines, including Chick Master machines, Jaceway machines. We have seen that there is a difference when you do the things right. You have a single stage and you don't do the things right, and you keep a profile that is too hot, your performance could be worse as well. The machine doesn't tell you the one that decides the profile of temperatures is you as a manager. And on the feed conversion also, you can see some improvements. Sometimes, like in this case, we were not able to see it significantly significant until the end of the flock, but normally we are able to see between 1 and 2 points of feed conversion, even in commercial conditions. So in this experiment, they actually check cooler temperatures than optimum and hotter temperatures than optimum. And I like this experiment developed by Dr. Hewlett a few years ago that shows that is always a little more detrimental for livability. And you can see here, livability is impaired a lot. So a lot of chicks die at different points, especially even at the end. They can die at 42, 44 days, they can start dying more. And the body weights will also suffer more with hotter temperatures. But sometimes the feed conversion is true when you go too cold on those chicks, on those eggs, actually, the feed conversion could be affected. So there is always an optimum. There is not just keeping the cool. No, you need to keep close to the optimum temperature. And here, this is a commercial condition, Chick Master machines, both single and multi-stage were Chick Master machines, but with the single stage, we will observe it with Dr. Wineland here, higher moisture loss on the multi-stage, so that helped with the hydration of the chicks. We had actually higher mortality in the multi-stage compared to the single stage. And the body weights, especially at the end here, were about 50 grams better for the single stage machines. And that difference was mainly observed also more on the females that you see here compared to the males when we evaluate those in heavy raw 708 broilers at 56 days of age. And some work done years ago with Dr. Brake was the importance of the higher or hotter temperatures during incubation on the hatchers, how it affects the body weight. It's only 1 or 2 grams. You probably won't see it. You see difference in the color. We took these pictures right after hatch, and some of the things that we observed was the reduction on the heart. And we have seen it in many other experiments, and many other people have published how really almost is the same chick with 1/3 less of heart. So it has to work harder and easily can have problems with ascites or with problems with sudden death syndrome. Also, the gastrointestinal system is a little smaller, 13% smaller, and the intestines could be shorter, as I'll show you in a second, or the enzymes may not work as well. We had done that work also with Dr. Christensen, Bernd Christensen years ago. So when we talk about ascites, many people have demonstrated that hypoxia during the hatchery especially could cause this muscular hypoxia. So when we talk about myopathies that we will talk about in a moment, well, it's a very similar system. The muscle suffer hypoxia, suffer stress, and then some get affected, and that could be very early in life. The ascites, a water belly that you see on all those problems, there is a hypertrophy of the right ventricle of the heart, and that could lead to higher mortality, or even some of those that survive will have problems with growth, and it will have lower performance, or it will be more deaths on arrival, for example. And these are experiments that we did with COB 500. Any chicks can get affected. In this case, we did it with cubs, and you see that in the single stage, we had a higher or bigger heart, and also we see the hypertrophy of the right ventricle, bigger right ventricle of the heart in the multi-stage, where there are more chances to have those stresses. And here is an experiment 2015 from this is a group from Turkey, showing that different stresses, how they cause changes. This is where the changes that they have between having a chronic stress here in these triangles, or an acute stress here in these gray squares, and the control where actually the temperature, the eggshell temperature was, machine temperature was reduced, then the eggshell temperature was tried to maintain close to the optimum. And when I told you 101, 102, you start having differences on those development of the heart, and that will affect, if you have any of stress at the end, you will affect performance no matter what. Feed intake, they may eat more, but they convert worse, especially when you have chronic stress. So if you have it for just a few minutes, there is a problem with the feed conversion. But if this heat stress is prolonged, is a little higher, then you are going to have even worse results. And the main part of the mortality comes here from this higher development of the right ventricle. So definitely there is a clear diagnosis here that there was an ascites, and the authors report that as one of the biggest problems that they had. But if we go now to the intestines, in the intestines, we are going to have differences on the gut development. And many times when you do necropsies first week or even 42 days, you are going to see these yolk sac that many countries they call the vitalicious yolk sac that remains there because the animal is not able to absorb it, and the intestines get shorter compared to the others. So these differences on development affect greatly how the animal will perform, and also will make it less efficient and more susceptible to develop different kind of diseases. And in many experiments, we have evaluated that really there is a significant difference at hatch on the relative length of these guts. So we have guts that are shorter always, every time at hatch. Later, throughout the life, what we see is the intestines tend to get larger. Why? Because these are not only shorter, but they are less efficient. We have captured a little reduction on the digestibility, just because the gut tends to elongate to compensate for that initial development delay. So then you have, at the end, you are going to have a bird with a larger intestine that is less efficient, worse feed conversion, and develops and grows less, and so it's less productive. And it's not only the intestine per se, there is also effects on the livers, because when the chick is, or the hatchling, the turkey, the duck is trying to hatch, then they are spending more of this glycogen, and consequently the liver will suffer in weight. The gizzard proventriculus, I showed you, this is reduced, and the intestine, as I showed you, not only in the length, but also we can put it on the weight, is a little smaller at hatch. Later it changes, but since we don't have much time, we go now to the muscle, striated muscle. So we have these myopathies in everywhere in the world. People start seeing it now, even at 35, 42 days, you start seeing different myopathies. You can have the striped muscle, you can have a little harder muscle, or wooden brace, different degrees of wooden brace that you can have, even to have the hardest. Or you can have these myopathies of the spaghetti muscle. There are other myopathies like the deep pectoral myopathy or green muscle disease, or the dorsal myopathy, that is also some hemorrhages that happens on the dorsal part that close to the wings, and then you are going to have some discoloration of the meat. Well, through the years, we investigate these, and we observed that these areas, the hatcher, when you have especially low oxygen concentration, high temperatures, then you have reduced airflow, that you have less oxygen going through the chick, and then the embryo suffers. The chick, you know that it will produce more urates, is basically because there is degradation of the muscle. We started doing this probably in 2005, 2006, when myopathies were not in the radar, were not talked by anybody, but Dr. Christensen was already investigating that. My computer is very sensitive, and now I want to show you this part. When then that happens, we were able to investigate the whole physiology. We have this in a chapter with Dr. Belleman and Dr. Chris, no, Dr. Wineland. So these are my co-authors on that chapter. So you can read the whole process that happens. So there is a problem with vasodilatation on the embryo. There are reduced flow to the heart and the brain. The chicks, when you go, they will have harder time to go to the feed. And also there is later a vasoconstruction in the tissue, especially the muscle. So then it starts an anaerobic metabolism that will produce more lactate. It will consume more of the initially of those glycogen. You ended up with this metabolism. Then you have the lactate and some muscle degradation that will increase those urates. So you see a lot of urates on the bottom of the chicks, and they have more difficulties. There is a whole changes on the physiology and on the molecules that deal with the satellite cells and these molecules that are here in the muscle. So then the myoblasts, the cells that are going to form more of these fibers, are reduced. And there is a process immediately that the animal will do with muscle degradation, muscle regeneration. That process is possible to happen, but it has a limit. When the stress is too high, then the myotubes and others will suffer. So then those cells will go from the fibrosis to a process to convert to adipose and tissue, and that is the reason that we have those white stripes, and we have those changes that deal later with the wooden brace. We are going to have changes with lipid infiltration, fibrolytic problems, and later you have lower muscle vascularization, tissue hypoxia, and the cells are really affected. They have lower muscle regeneration capacity. And when these chicks later go to the field, and if they have thermal stress during the transportation in the farm, then they can have, and later maybe high density diets to try to grow them well, then they can have a fast grow, and the myopathies can show a little more. And we have done tests showing this, and we have seen it that years ago. This was sponsored by the US Poultry and Egg in 2006, published by Dr. Christensen and our group, where we saw the degeneration that can happen with these higher temperatures and low oxygen concentration. That at that time wasn't myopathies. We didn't check them at the end, but later, years ago, we did it with different strains, and we observed that independently of the strain, we will have some increment on the incidence, and some lines will be more susceptible to have higher incidence of these myopathies when they have problems with the heat stress. The leg problems is another, is muscles and also bones are affected. Then here on the bones, we need to think that the embryo develops all these cells and part of the ossification happens very early in life, and then when they hatch, those cells are ready to act, and if they are affected, they won't have as good ossification as they should, and then you are going to have some birds that will have some twisted legs, some problems with that, and many times we also see crooked toes. That is pretty much that also the collagen was affected, and this was under commercial conditions. We got these differences in between multi-stage and single stage, and that this was evaluated in hundreds of chicks, and we did we observed that clearly the single stage had lower of these indices. Even the valgus was also lower. This was published in Journal Applied Poultry Science, Poultry Research, and also we had changes on the locomotion. Remember that the bones are one factor. There are other factors that are affected on locomotion, like tendons, for example. So even the vertebrae could be affected. We had been working with a group here in NC State where we have been checking on this problem. That is the spondylitis enterococcica. So then is when there is an infection, and what we observed in this case is that when you have these type of lesions that paralyze the birds, that they cannot move about 35 days, you have this type of lesion, this taken by Dr. Luke Borges from NC State, and with their group, what we were able to detect is that there is a high correlation between this damage of the cartilage. When the cartilage, if you see, there is a separation here that is called osteochondrosis dissecans. So the cartilage in between the vertebrae, especially the T5, T4, and T5, in the dorsal part, they get damaged. So then that damage is where the bacteria tend to start hiding and growing and creating this infection that may later go to be an abscess. So then we observed that the suboptimal incubation increases something that scientists have been reporting for 25, 30 years, that is called, something called higher relative asymmetry. Asymmetry is basically that one leg is, or one bone is not the same size, the same length that their parallel or parallel sides. So the right and the left are not exactly the same. So the animal has to do some changes on the gait, and that changes on the gait creates some wobbling when they are walking, and that wobbling creates friction between the vertebra, and the vertebra then it can start having damages very early in life, and consequently then later then this is one of the main effects that the bacteria that could be circulating, especially some bacteria that tend to have more collagenase, it has more pathogenicity, then tends to infect those areas. Tendons is another issue that people report with legs that some are affected, those green muscle, green legs that some people call. And when people try to isolate, not always is reovirus. Many times they do the whole process of diagnosis and isolation, and only 33, 35% of the cases are reovirus. In many cases, this tendon damage, especially the gastrocnemius right here, is the one that is affected and is not related with a disease, a pathogen directly. But we observed it with a work done with the University of Georgia. We grow we did incubation, we grew the birds and all that, and we observed that they have different tendon structures. So these tendon structures really were affected by the incubation. Even the fibers were measured, and we observed that when we have this red, that is not the suboptimal incubation, the fibers of the tendons were a little smaller, in the same way that I showed you the lower development of the intestines and also changes on the bone. It happens. Not only that, skin, in general, remember, they have in common the collagen. The type of collagen that it should grow in each one of these tissues is affected. When we go to the pododermatitis, always we have been thinking about the wet litter and maybe droppings that are sticky and so forth. But sometimes we are forgetting about the susceptibility that some birds may have already when they arrive to the farm to those conditions. And remember, there is a flock, when it's too wet, yes, maybe 90% of the flock will be wet. But also, when it's too dry, you see dermatitis. And it's too dry, but still 10, 20% of the flocks could have dermatitis. Why? So then some people, the Netherlands, these guys like to check on different things. And this is what we need to look a lot on the data. So this study was published when we were already working on this with one of my graduate students, Dr. Da Costa, that now works for Zoetis. And Dr. Da Costa checked this paper where we observed here that the hatchery was also important on that. And we were working in this process on checking on different levels of dermatitis. It was a system developed by some French people, but I think that it was published in British Poultry Science, which checks the different incidence of the pododermatitis. And in our experiments, we were observing that the hot incubation, whatever it was done at the end, especially hot at the end, was causing that we had more dermatitis. So we went to the histology of the skin, and we took samples and observed this papilla and tried to do measurements of the different layers of the skin of the papillas and measure both the thickness and also the areas of the skin. Actually, Manuel and many other students did this process, and then we developed the measurements of the size of the papilla, and we obtained these results. Always when we had this incubation at different age periods, we did it in cages, we did it later in floor pens. We observed that the external layer of the skin the stratus corneum was always thinner. So if you have a thinner layer there, so the penetration of the water and the chemicals that are normally in the litter, well, it will be faster, and consequently you can have some breakage of the skin, and you can have some problems with the development. And here, new shavings in our experimental conditions where we can keep the litter a little dry, relatively common stocking density, so we didn't have that many chicks and all that. But the development of the skin, that is stratus corneum, up to 42 days, when we had suboptimal incubation, these low temperatures at the beginning, high temperatures at the end, we had lower development of the skin. So optimal incubation, good skin, less food part dermatitis. Even the size of the papilla, we observe this with dogs. And that makes that when we have these conditions of the papilla difference on the development, makes that the papilla of the chickens that are with the suboptimal incubation will have more chances to stick the droppings, the same droppings, but now due to the flat area that they have, then they stick there and they are not able to get rid of that material, and consequently they stay longer and they affect the problem with the dermatitis. And when Manuel did this, investigate what was happening at the different moistures, we measured the moisture liter because that is also affected. That was also something interesting that we found. We observed that when you have a standard incubation, then independently of the humidity, there is almost the same dermatitis, okay? But when you have the bad incubation here in red, then that dermatitis increases if you have especially the high humidity. And we did it at 14 days, and you observe that it's almost double, but by 20 days, it could be almost 6 times more susceptibility to have more dermatitis in those birds. So the pododermatitis is higher. But something interesting that I told you that I mentioned is the utilization of water. The ones that come from flocks that are under good incubation, they have lower moisture in the litter compared to those that at the end they have some high temperatures during the last days of incubation. No matter if they were standard or they were low at the beginning, both of them tend to be a little higher on a little moisture, and consequently they were either spilling more water. That is another option, that it seems that they spill more feed and spill more water, and also maybe something related with the metabolism. But in the same way that we affect the skin, we affect the feathers. So we have observed it in many different experiments, things done by Dr. Brake many years ago, that show that high temperatures cause the overheating cause a delay on feather development. So then that is observed here in different periods. I think that Kelly Brannan, that is present from South Africa in this webinar, also did part of that work. But one of my students won an award doing all this work, demonstrating that with different experiments, I only have a couple here, showing that when we measure these feather follicles, the incubation, actually the bad incubation, reduces the number of follicles, especially at the dorsum and also at the breast. On the thighs, we saw an increase in this, but in another experiment, we observed that pretty much everything that was hot or everything that was hot in the hatchers had lower numbers of feather follicles in the breast. So that affects problems that you can have a lot of contact with the litter and all that because you don't have feather cover in that area. I think that I already showed this part of the gut length. And so I'll go here for the immunity just to finish. I think when we have the bursa of Fabricius affected, then sometimes we think about the virus or the bursa virus, the Gumboro virus, but in reality, sometimes also the hatcher too hot could cause that there is a delay on the development of the bursa, and the delay on the development of the thymus, or not only the humoral immunity, but also the cellular immunity can be affected. And when those chickens hatch, when they have been under elevated temperatures, you are going to observe also that there is some stress, or there is a reduction. You see lower numbers here with elevated temperatures, where you see a reduction on the numbers of lymphocytes, and there is a stress. That stress that those birds have during the incubation remains even during the first 7 days. And you know that stress generally tends to be immunosuppressive and cause that they have less problems with, or more problems with the development of immunity. Checking here in a James Webb machine, we are checking the reason of actually the hatching window. So we are checking how it performs using the nice sensors that these machines has. And then you are looking at the relative humidity, and you can determine when they are hatching in a nice way. So when you have hatch windows that are too prolonged, then these chicks remain too long without access to feed and water. And if your processing and your transportation take longer, maybe they are fasting for more than 48 hours. And all studies have shown that when birds fast for around that time, 2 days, then from the time of hatch, and remember that that can happen before harvest, so then you can have them for 24, 40 hours in the hatchers, plus the time that they go to the farm, then you have a delay on the development of the immunity. And that is what it is showing here. The ones in black, they were fed right a few hours after hatch, while the others last for 48 hours. And consequently, there is a huge difference on the development of different responses in the whole gastrointestinal tract, but especially at the end of that. So infections with salmonella, with coli, with clostridium, with coccidia, they could be a little affected, and those birds could replicate those bacteria and parasites because they have less immunity against them. And also the bursa development that I mentioned, the migration of cells to the bursa and different CD4, CD8 cells is delayed even for about 2 weeks. So all the vaccines that you apply during the first 2 weeks could be affected. So in conclusions, optimum incubation conditions are necessary for adequate embryo development and to obtain a healthy hatchling capable to express its genetic potential. All are affected. And beginning and end of incubation are the most critical periods to check. I would say that you should avoid the high temperatures, especially at the end of incubation, reducing the temperature profiles and managing ventilation. And suboptimal incubation may affect negatively all physiological systems and cause multiple health issues. Investing in good incubation pays back. I forgot to mention at the beginning that there are some stimulus that are positive sometimes for the development of, for example, better resistance to heat stress, or even to develop muscle. So heat stress, if you do a little higher temperatures, about 16, 14, 16 days, only for a few hours, it has to be for 1 or 2 hours, half of a degree to 1 degree higher than the recommended temperature, then you can stimulate some heat stress resistance by heat shock proteins. And if you do kind of the same stimulus, you can sometimes, and with light, green light, for example, during incubation, you can stimulate some muscle development. But those cases, part of what is called circadian incubation, some cases are sometimes more difficult to manage, that sometimes they create more variation. So it's better at least that you guarantee the best conditions for the embryos. So with this, I finished that was all. And I think that I went over a few minutes, and we started at 11:05, so a few minutes only over, but I think that we have time for questions, and I'll be glad to answer anything that you.
No, you did great.
And all yours for the questions.
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much about going over time. There's a lot of good information there. Yeah, if you can unshare your screen, then I'll ask. Got a few questions from some of our people here. There we go. So a lot of your information, I found it interesting as well, a lot of your information comparing the single stage and multi-stage, and there's a number of reasons why we see differences there. But one of the questions was, so if people have multi-stage, what are your best recommendations to try and reduce some of the effects you've seen when you have all this comparative data?
Yeah. So in the multi-stage, depending on the type of machine, is first, Not because this is James Way, but it allows me to talk well about James Way anyway. The system on James Way is a multi-stage with the cards, but in some way it maintains the flow of air in a way that the ones that need more heat, they will receive it compared to the ones that have less heat. So that helps, and a ventilation system like that, it helps. Another way that it can be improved is really for most of the machines that you have to do multiple sets, like multi-stage machines, then to try to do a good pre-warming, and in that way you can keep them more stable. I think that even for some, in some cases, I have observed that when the rooms are cool, even some James Way machines get some benefit of that, and we have discussed that with Keith and other technical people from James Way, that sometimes that could make the difference between those that have them in the rooms. But I will say, if you have a multi-stage machines, and that is what you're going to have for a few years, because they last and for a long time, then the other part that you can improve is really the hatchers that I mentioned a lot, that even that if they are very old, that you can still, with serpentines and different ideas, improving the plenums, improving the dampers, you can actually improve the circulation of the air, have good cooling capacity. You can put more if you want serpentines on the sides, if you want more air, depending on the system that you have, you can improve, especially the hatches, and use down step, like a step down the temperatures during the whole period of in the hatcheries. If you can transfer a little earlier, we know that generally these modern chicks nowadays, they start producing a lot of feed about 17 days and a half, 18 days. So if you can have a chance, if your system allows, if you're not doing vaccination or something like that, then maybe you can transfer a little earlier, and in that way you can cool down those birds and give them more air, and it will be better. So that I would say some designs of trays, new trays, also help like that in that sense.
I think a lot of it goes back to just ventilation, making sure the machines run properly, because it's all about uniformity. I think. I mean, we're not gonna set our machines with a set point that's going to make the temperature high or low. But if our ventilation isn't accurate, dampers and fans and fan blades and spacing and all that stuff, we will have the microenvironments that you talked about, which is going to give us some hot and cool spots in the machine. So it's just all about ventilation. And so if you're seeing that, yeah, we need to go back and make sure the machines are doing what they're supposed to. Whether they're James Way, Chickmaster, multi-stage, whatever, it all is the same thing. So.
Yeah, I forgot to mention that good maintenance, so it's normal that with all the conditions, the high humidity and all that we are having, these machines may suffer some things with the turning and on the fans and all that, the sensors. So good maintenance, good cleaning whenever it's possible. It's very important to reduce as much as possible the microenvironments that I mentioned is one of the critical issues and on multi-stage machines.
Yep. Just in your opinion, I mean, you talked about all the different possibilities that can happen during incubation, and I mean, what would you call acceptable percentages of early, mid, and late dead? I mean, there's a certain amount that's biological that's going to happen. What is, in your interpretation, what's acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, I go by the standards that are on the line according to the age of the breeder, and yeah, that will affect it a lot, because in some part I feel sometimes that is a little bit related to the fertility on the early deaths, that could be a factor, but also the eggs and all that, that affects a little bit, and yeah, if you can, I have seen places where they can keep it as low as 0.5 and 0.3 on mid deaths and all that. So then those are optimals, but it depends on the company. There are some conditions that either by the hot temperatures and all that, they hardly can reach it. So then they have more early deaths. But I will go for that table and check, depending on the age of the breeder, I can allow a little more mortality, going to 3-5% sometimes. That will be still acceptable in some occasions.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I look at embryo loss, total embryo loss. Even in a good flock with good conditions, we're going to have, 4 to 5% embryo loss in the best conditions, best flocks. And you can kind of split that to 2 to 2.5 early, 2 to 2.5 late, half in the middle. And of course, like you said, fertility will affect that. Age of the birds absolutely will affect that, and you'll start seeing the numbers go up. But we can't say we're going to try to get zero, because that's not going to happen. But I think in that range, like you said, and there's a lot of age factors as well. What is your preferable temperature at the end of incubation compared to the beginning? I mean, and a lot of it I understand is machine specific, but when we start getting in that hatchers, where are you looking at trying to keep these chicks as they hatch?
Yeah. When we start doing these step down systems, normally the transfer, the lowest that I have seen is could be in 98, 90.5. If they do transfer when they have a room where they can keep that temperature a little hotter. So if they are coming in a single stage with already around 98 or even a little lower, I have seen profiles that go in the setters a little lower, then the transfer could start around that 98, and I have seen companies going as low as even 93. I would say that if you can go 94 or something in a step down and have the last hour, so you have to make longer steps at the beginning and shorter steps at the end, then the last hours, if I'm opening the door, on the other side, you already have temperatures of 80 or 78 on the corridor. So having them at 3-4 hours before going already to 94 is fine. As I told you, I have seen companies going as low, large companies incubating big numbers of chickens going as low as 93 in 92.5 in the past years, because they consider that. So they go down as much as they probably will have then already at the farm. So then at the farm, they are looking for this 93. So that is what they give them at the very end. So they are step by step getting them accustomed to that temperature. The only situation that I see on this, doing this, that you need to be careful is that your machines have a good cooling capacity with a different system that is not related only to spraying water. So if you are forcing a machine, for example, a chick master machine, forcing them to cool down only with what the machine can do on the foggers, that could be negative, because it can create a lot of disuniformity in the machine and spraying a lot of water and creating those, I call it butterflies on the back part of with all the down and all the debris kind of stick to the back part, and that is basically because the machine may not have the capacity of moving that whole air outside, and the machine is trying, the controller is trying to cool down, sending more and more water. So you need to balance that, and if you have good circulation, good serpentine capacity, or what happens with the James waves, then you can actually move more air, and you have the bigger fans and all that, then you can go down as low as that. And even in old machines, I have been able to see that people just improve that cooling, and then they avoid the problem with spraying, and they still have good quality chicks at the end.
How would this be affected for temperature, humidity, whatever, if somebody's incubating or hatcheries in high altitude? I mean, what kind of adjustments would you think need to be made?
Yeah, with high altitude, what I have seen in most of them, those that actually don't inject air, that I have visited several companies that use oxygen at the end, but some that they just are over the let's say 1,500 meters over sea level, then better air circulation. What I have seen also that it helps to improve is with the plenums. Try to work with the plenums a little better, that you have not only just cooling, but actually that there is more air movement through the system. But important that the pressures are not too high in a way that the air more will move just across the machine without actually mixing first, to have really good oxygenation of the birds at the very end. So then that it has to be balanced, and it will be measuring the pressure, how long is the machine, and how the fans are working in order to keep ventilation, but without creating that effect of just sucking air without being first mix and really oxygenate the bird. So that's what I have seen. But another experience that I have observed, and we even have research recently done on injecting air oxygen at the end of the cycle, and that has also shown positive effects.
Okay. When you're looking at factors that are causing some embryo mortality, particularly early embryo death, I mean, what are your main causes when you start looking at, early embryo death? Pre-incubation, temperature, egg quality, handling. What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, on the early dates, what many times we see is management of the eggs at the farm. Sometimes the delays on collecting and all that. I mentioned a little bit of that pretty much there are some people that had studied this for years, and they observed that if you have them more than 6 hours in the nest, even if it is a cool morning in an area, with the heat that the hens are putting in there, if those eggs don't go out, then the embryo will continue developing, and then will be in a stage that won't last too much on storage. And it will have a harder time to start, especially if later the pre-warming is not good. So the next factors that I also have seen, and recently we were working in a company, like last week, we were working with this company where they are going out from this period of pandemic where they were not able to actually produce a lot of these chicks, and also the broilers. So they went down on breeders, and now they have problems to have enough eggs. So consequently, everything that is getting laid is going directly to the machines. So that process of actually starting the incubation without having even 8 hours, so they get the eggs in the morning, by noon they are in the machine. That also affects the changes on the pH of the egg and how they start, and we see a big loss in mortality like that. So as I mentioned, it's not delaying too much, but also not going too fast, because that happens, and it's a reality now. Many parts of the world are going back to deal with the needs for more eggs, because the people are having demand of the cheapest meat available, and now they don't have eggs, and they are going to in less than this company has 6 hours. They told me about other companies that if they can get them as soon as possible, at the end they don't win anything. They big mortality in that case, and now is that I have read it, I have seen it in research, but now I see it in big numbers, and in reality we did some changes with some machines, and in 80,000 hatches, then you actually see the big difference just by weighing the 20 hours, not even 24 hours, but 20 hours, 22 hours, and there is a safe on early mortality. Other issues could be the transportation. When there is a lot of vibration, companies that have problems in transportation of the eggs, or by bad management, they lose a lot of early mortality there. And very disuniform conditions and long storage. I would say long storage is the other thing that will damage a lot of your embryos early in life, especially if you don't do anything to improve that storage, or your storage is not uniform, and so forth, if you don't have a good storage.
Yeah, so a lot of it is pre-incubator. A lot of our main causes, what I've seen as well. What about humidity? We know how you talked about how it affects our moisture loss in our eggs. What is another role that it could have an effect on that, other than moisture loss? Is there another role that humidity, high or low, can affect? How it can affect the embryo?
Yeah, I would say the other thing, the big deal is that sometimes the bacteria contamination and microbiological issues. And even if you have humidity too high, then the oxygen concentrations won't be the same. The pressures of the pressure of the oxygen also may not be the same, and it may affect the embryo development. But I would say that affects more nowadays the contamination that some machines can get when you have a high moisture during the time. The other factor is that if you don't lose that much water during the time, then the formation of the air chamber may not be as good. And definitely sometimes the chicks can hatch, and then you have chicks that don't go directly to the, so you have those hatch on the side instead of going to the air chamber. And then the quality of the chick at the end, that's another thing that I didn't mention, that there are studies showing that the performance at the end of those chicks, it will be reduced when they don't hatch directly, when they don't have good air chamber during that period.
Yeah. If you get situations where we get high temperatures during an endothermic stage, so 12, 14, 16 days of incubation, what would you see in the day-old chicks and day-old chick quality?
12, 14 days, then many times that,
well, anytime in that high endothermic stage, 14, 16, even 7, the last stages.
Yeah, the last stages that will accelerate the embryo more. There are studies also recently published that shows that even 1 degree, also if you are off, instead of being in 103, that you are going, some people start with 104. During the first 3 days, even 7 days, a little higher on temperature accelerates the embryos. If it goes too high, then you are going to have a lot of developmental problems. But after that, when they start producing heat, they will accelerate them a lot. That's another. They will grow faster. If it is prolonged, then you are going to have problems with maturation, and sometimes at the transfer, they will be not in the right position, and with any kind of little problem on the transfer, and they hit the embryo, then they will have more chances to die in that period, and then they won't absorb the yolk well. So then malpositions, that is another factor that because of that, they accelerate too much, and when it's the time, then it doesn't go in conjunction with the absorption of the yolk that they should be having, and actually the right formation of the air chamber and the other processes needed for them to do the good position for do the internal peeping. Instead of that, they will be under the wing. I mean, it will be in positions that will difficult their hatch, and then you are going to have internal peeps and other things that they die just because they were not synchronic, and just due to these changes from temperature as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for your comments, and a very, very excellent webinar. Definitely one that I will watch a couple more times to really digest everything you said, because there's a lot of really good information there. And I think for producers out there that are trying to understand the effects of the embryo on our chicks and chick performance and chick quality, I think incubation is becoming more and more accepted as a role in that. And so a lot of the work you showed tells us that our chick quality has a lot of dependency on our incubation quality. So thank you so much for those comments.